The train rumbled across the vast, open plains of Minnesota, a long steel snake cutting through an endless sea of green and gold. Inside, the German prisoners of war sat in stunned silence. For months, they had been fed stories of America, a nation of decadent gangsters and weak-willed capitalists, a hollow shell that would crumble under the might of the Reich. They had expected a barren wasteland, a country starved by the war effort. Instead, what they saw from the grimy windows was a land of impossible plenty. Fields of corn stretched to the horizon, so tall and green they looked like painted scenery. Barns, bigger than some German village churches, stood proudly, each painted a defiant, cheerful red. There were no bomb craters, no skeletal remains of burned-out buildings, no hollow-eyed children begging for scraps. There were only wide-open skies and a sense of space so profound it was terrifying. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Richter, a man whose pride was as starched as his now tattered collar, sneered at the whispers of awe from his men. "Do not be fooled by this facade," he hissed in German. "It is a trick, a hollow display meant to weaken your resolve. Remember who you are. We are German soldiers." Among the prisoners was a young corporal named Klaus, a boy of 19 who had been drafted from his family's farm near Bavaria. He had never seen an ocean until he was put on a ship to America. Now, he was seeing a country that defied all logic. He saw a farmer on a tractor, a gleaming green machine that moved with more power than a dozen horses. The farmer's wife was hanging laundry on a line, and behind her a car was parked next to the house. A personal car. The sight was so jarring, so completely alien to his war-torn reality, that he felt a wave of dizziness. The train finally slowed, its brakes screeching as it pulled into a small station next to their destination, Camp New Hoffnung. The name, New Hope, was a cruel joke, Richter thought. But as the men were herded off the train, the surprises continued. The guards were not the snarling monsters they had been warned about. They were older men mostly, members of the National Guard, with tired eyes and a professional demeanor. They carried rifles, but not with the aggressive readiness the prisoners were used to, and then they saw her. Sergeant Catherine O'Malley stood near the camp's entrance, a clipboard in her hand. She was with the Women's Army Corps, a WAC, assigned to the camp as a translator and administrative assistant. Her uniform was neat, her posture was perfect, but to the American guards and the German prisoners alike, she was a complete anomaly. A woman in a soldier's uniform, here to manage men who had been fighting a brutal war. Captain Miller, the camp's commanding officer, walked over to her. He was a man who believed the world was made of straight lines and simple rules, and women did not belong in any part of his army that wasn't behind a typewriter. "Sergeant," he said, not bothering to hide his disdain, "I want you to process their paperwork. Just the paperwork. Stay out of the way of the men." "Yes, sir," Kate replied, her voice even. She was used to it. She was fluent in German, thanks to her mother, who had emigrated from Germany in the 20s. It was the entire reason she'd been assigned to this post. Yet her skill was treated as a liability, a strange party trick rather than a valuable military asset. The other guards snickered as Miller walked away. One of them, a corporal named Davis, muttered, "Don't you worry your pretty little head, Sergeant. We'll handle the real work." Kate ignored him. She watched the German prisoners line up, their faces a mixture of fear, arrogance, and confusion. She saw Oberleutnant Richter, his jaw set in defiance, and she saw the young Corporal Klaus, whose eyes were wide with a kind of terrified wonder. Stepping forward, Kate cleared her throat. In clear, unaccented German, she began to read the camp's induction instructions. "You will be assigned to a barracks. You will receive food, clothing, and medical attention in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You are expected to follow all camp rules." A ripple of shock went through the prisoners. They stared at her, this American woman speaking their language perfectly. Richter's eyes narrowed with contempt. A woman giving them orders? In their own tongue? He saw it as another American humiliation tactic. "We do not need instructions from a woman," Richter said loudly in German, a challenge in his voice. Kate's eyes met his. She did not flinch. "Oberleutnant," she replied, her German still calm and formal. "Your rank in the German army does not apply here. You are a prisoner of war. I am a sergeant in the United States Army. You will listen to my instructions or you will be placed in solitary confinement. Is that clear? The American guards, who didn't understand the words, saw the confrontation. They saw the arrogant German officer and the young woman who didn't back down. Captain Miller frowned from a distance, seeing not a competent sergeant, but a problem he would have to solve. Richter held her gaze for a long moment before giving a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. He had been silenced for now. Kate finished the instructions and stepped back, her heart pounding. It wasn't fear. It was the familiar, bitter feeling of having to fight twice as hard just to do her job. Later that evening, the prisoners were given their first meal in the camp mess hall. They were expecting thin soup and stale bread. What they got was a piece of meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a slice of soft white bread with a pat of real butter. Klaus stared at his plate. It was more food than he had seen in a single meal in over a year. He watched as another prisoner took a sip of coffee and his eyes widened. It was real coffee with real sugar. The men ate in a bewildered silence. This was not a punishment. This was not a prison camp as they understood it. This was something else entirely. They had been prepared for a fight, for hardship, for a battle of wills. They were not prepared for this strange, unsettling kindness. They were not prepared for the unbelievable sight of a country that could fight a war across 2 oceans and still have enough butter for its prisoners. As Kate finished her duties for the night, she walked past Captain Miller's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard him talking to one of his lieutenants. "The woman is a problem," Miller said, his voice low and angry. "She's too familiar with them." Speaking their language like that, staring down an officer. "It's insubordination waiting to happen," the lieutenant murmured something in agreement. "I'm putting in a request for her transfer," Miller continued. This was a mistake. "I'll have her in a secretarial pool in Chicago by the end of the month." "This is a man's job." Kate froze, her hand gripping the strap of her satchel. She closed her eyes, fighting back a surge of fury and frustration. She had joined the WACs to serve her country, to use her skills to make a difference. But here, in this place of new hope, it seemed her biggest battle wouldn't be with the enemy soldiers in front of the wire, but with the supposed allies standing right beside her. She took a deep breath and walked away into the cool Minnesota night, the sounds of the stunned German prisoners in the mess hall echoing behind her. Her fight was just beginning. The days at Camp New Hoffnung settled into a routine, but the sense of disbelief among the German prisoners never faded. It only deepened. Due to the wartime labor shortage, many of them were assigned to work on the local farms, supervised by American guards. For men who had only known the rigid hierarchy and brutal scarcity of Nazi Germany, stepping into the world of rural Minnesota was like stepping onto another planet. Corporal Klaus was assigned to a work detail on the Jensen family farm, a few miles from the camp. He, along with a dozen other prisoners, was tasked with helping bring in the harvest. Sergeant Kate O'Malley was assigned to the detail as their translator, an order that Captain Miller had given grudgingly. He made it clear he was watching her, waiting for a single misstep. The first day on the farm, Mr. Jensen, a stoic man of Scandinavian descent, lined the prisoners up. He was wary. His son was fighting in the Pacific, and he wasn't happy about having the enemy on his land. Through Kate, he gave them instructions, pointing to the fields and the equipment. The Germans worked hard, but their eyes were constantly darting around, taking in sights that shattered their worldview. They saw Mrs. Jensen drive up in a dusty Ford pickup truck, bringing them water in glass jars. A woman driving a truck with such casual confidence was a marvel. In the afternoon, the Jensen's daughter, a girl of 16, brought them sandwiches, white bread with thick slices of ham. The girl wasn't afraid of them. She was just curious, watching them with wide, blue eyes. During a break, Klaus saw something lying on the porch of the farmhouse. A Sears, Roebuck and Commerce catalog. He had heard of such things but had never seen one. Timidly, he pointed to it and asked Kate what it was. "It's a catalog," she explained. "You can order things from it, and they deliver them to your house by mail." This was too much for the other prisoners to ignore. They gathered around as Klaus, with Kate's permission, carefully picked it up. He opened the thick book and the men gasped. Page after page was filled with unbelievable treasures. There were dozens of different kinds of shoes, suits and dresses in every color, tools for every imaginable task. There were pages for washing machines, refrigerators, and radios. There were toys for children, shiny bicycles, elaborate dolls, and electric train sets. All of this. For ordinary people? One prisoner whispered in German, his voice full of awe. Yes, Kate said simply. Oberleutnant Richter, who was on a different work detail, had warned them it was all propaganda. But this was not a poster or a film. This was a book, thick and heavy with the sheer weight of American abundance. It was real. Klaus looked from the pictures in the catalog to the Jensen's farm. The sturdy house, the big red barn, the truck, the tractor. The Jensens were not aristocrats. They were simple farmers. Yet they lived like kings compared to the farmers back in Germany. The foundation of everything he had been taught began to crack. Kate watched them, a complicated mix of pity and pride swirling within her. This was the America her mother had wanted for her, a place of quiet, simple opportunity. But her own place in it felt so precarious. Captain Miller's threat of a transfer hung over her head like a storm cloud. He often drove out to the farms for inspections, which were really just opportunities to scrutinize her every move. He'd criticize the way she stood, the way she translated, accusing her of being either too lenient or too harsh. It was an impossible balancing act. One afternoon, the simmering tension boiled over. The men were finishing their work in the barn, cleaning and storing tools. Mr. Jensen was doing a final check when he let out a frustrated grunt. "My socket wrench is gone," he said, looking at the prisoners with renewed suspicion. "The good one. It was right here on this bench." The friendly atmosphere of the past week evaporated. The prisoners looked at each other, confused and scared. The American guards immediately became more rigid, their hands moving closer to their rifles. Kate stepped forward. "Mr. Jensen, perhaps it was just misplaced," she suggested calmly. "It was right here," he repeated, his voice hard. "I used it this morning." "One of them must have taken it." Captain Miller arrived minutes later, as if he had been waiting for just such an incident. His eyes gleamed with a kind of grim satisfaction as he surveyed the scene. He didn't ask questions. He made an immediate judgment. "I knew this was a mistake," Miller said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He glared at Kate. "This is what happens when you get too comfortable, Sergeant. Your lack of discipline has led to theft." "Sir, we don't know that anyone stole it," Kate protested, her cheeks flushing with anger. "No one has been searched. We haven't even properly looked for it." "They're thieves and saboteurs," Miller snapped. "Round them up. All work details are canceled. They're all confined to the camp until that wrench is returned." To Kate, he added in a lower, more menacing tone, "And you are on formal review, Sergeant. I told you I was watching you. Your little experiment in command is over." The prisoners were marched back to camp under heavy guard, the trust that had begun to build, now shattered. Back on the farm, Kate refused to leave. She felt a burning sense of injustice. She knew these men. She had watched them work. She had seen the looks on their faces as they paged through that Sears catalog. They weren't thieves. They were just defeated, bewildered boys. She started searching the barn herself, ignoring the departing guards' smirks. She was methodical, checking every corner, every box, every pile of hay. Mr. Jensen watched her for a while, his arms crossed, before sighing and heading back to the house. An hour passed. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed the Jensen's youngest son, a boy of about 10, peeking at her from behind a stack of hay bales. He looked terrified. "Did you see something?" Kate asked gently, kneeling down to his level. The boy hesitated, then nodded. "I was playing in here earlier," he whispered. "I was pretending to fix the tractor like Daddy. I think I put the wrench in the wrong toolbox." He led her to a dusty old box in the corner, a box filled with rusty, forgotten tools. And there it was, nestled amongst the old junk, Mr. Jensen's gleaming socket wrench. A wave of relief and vindication washed over Kate. She had been right. She had the proof. She grabbed the wrench and raced back to the camp, her heart pounding with a different kind of energy now. This would fix everything. Miller would have to admit he was wrong. She found Captain Miller in his office, smugly typing up his report. She marched in without knocking and placed the wrench on his desk with a loud clang. "It was found, sir," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The farmer's son misplaced it. It was in the barn the whole time. The prisoners didn't take it." Miller looked from the wrench to her face. He saw her triumphant expression, and his own face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "That's very interesting, Sergeant," he said slowly, his voice dripping with condescension. "But it doesn't change a thing. I've already filed my report about your lax supervision leading to an incident of suspected theft. My superiors have been notified." Kate stared at him, dumbfounded. "But it wasn't a theft. The evidence is right here. You can call Mr. Jensen." "Don't you tell me how to do my job," he said, his voice rising. "My report stands. A tool went missing on your watch. It created a security situation. The fact that you found it later is irrelevant. Maybe you should have been more careful in the first place." He picked up the wrench and dropped it into a desk drawer. "It's out of my hands now." "You're dismissed, Sergeant." Kate stood frozen for a moment, the injustice of it all landing like a physical blow. He didn't care about the truth. He only cared about being right, about winning. She had handed him the proof of her innocence, and he had thrown it back in her face. She turned and walked out of the office. Her shoulders slumped not in defeat, but under the heavy weight of a fight she now knew was deeply, personally unfair. The aftermath of the wrench incident was swift and humiliating. Captain Miller made good on his word. Sergeant Kate O'Malley was removed from all duties involving the prisoners and reassigned to the camp's records office, a small, windowless room filled with filing cabinets and the smell of stale paper. Her official review was pending, but the transfer papers to a secretarial pool were already being processed. It was a clear and public punishment, designed to make an example of her. The male guards, who had once merely snickered at her, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. She was, in their eyes, the woman who couldn't handle the job, who had been put in her place. Only Sergeant Frank Rizzo, an older, gravel-voiced soldier who had seen combat in the First World War, showed her any kindness. "Don't let him get to you, Kate," Rizzo said one evening, finding her staring blankly at a stack of supply manifests. "Miller's got a chip on his shoulder the size of a tank. This ain't about a wrench. It's about him not being able to stand a woman doing a job he thinks is his." "It doesn't matter what it's about, Frank," Kate said, her voice hollow. "He's winning." Meanwhile, inside the wire-fenced enclosures, the atmosphere in the POW barracks had soured. With Kate gone, the guards supervising the work details were harsher, more suspicious. Privileges were revoked. The small bridge of understanding that had been forming between the prisoners and the local community had been burned. Oberleutnant Richter seized the opportunity to reclaim his authority. "You see?" He would lecture his men in the evenings. "This is the true America. Their kindness is a mask. They look for any excuse to punish us. That woman was a spy, sent to soften you, to make you forget your duty, but not everyone was convinced." Corporal Klaus and some of the other younger prisoners remembered the Jensen family's kindness. They remembered the impossible Sears catalog. They remembered how Sergeant O'Malley had spoken to them with a firmness that was rooted in professionalism, not hatred. Richter's harsh words rang hollow against the memory of American abundance and unexpected decency. The barracks became a place of quiet, whispered arguments. Then a new, more dangerous problem began to creep through the camp. It started with a cough, then a fever. Within a week, a severe strain of pneumonia was spreading silently through one of the barracks. The men, weakened by years of war and poor nutrition before their capture, were especially vulnerable. The camp had a small infirmary and a single overworked doctor, but the prisoners were afraid to report their sickness. Richter had forbidden it. "We will show no weakness," he commanded. "To admit to sickness is to give them another weapon against us. We will endure this as German soldiers." For him, it was a matter of pride. For the sick men, it was a potential death sentence. In her stuffy office, Kate was drowning in paperwork. Her new job was to cross-reference supply requests with inventory logs. It was mind-numbingly dull, but her attention to detail was unwavering. And she started to notice something strange. The infirmary's logs showed weekly shipments of medical supplies, including precious penicillin, the new miracle drug. But the doctor's daily usage reports didn't add up. There were significant amounts of medicine, especially penicillin, that were being signed into inventory but were never administered to patients. They were simply vanishing. A cold suspicion began to form in her mind. This was more than just a clerical error. Someone was stealing medicine. Her first thought was to go to Captain Miller, but she knew that would be useless. He would accuse her of making up stories to deflect from her own disciplinary review. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone on the command staff. That night, she couldn't sleep. The thought of those missing supplies gnawed at her. Were the prisoners sick? Was that why the medicine was disappearing? She thought of Klaus, the young corporal with the curious eyes. She had to find out what was happening. Knowing the guard patrol schedules by heart, she slipped out of her barracks after midnight. She moved through the shadows, her heart pounding until she reached the fence line of the main POW enclosure. It was a massive risk. If she was caught, it wouldn't just be a transfer. It would be a court-martial. She found the barracks where she knew Klaus slept and let out a low, soft whistle. A few moments later, a shadow detached from the darkness inside. It was him. "Corporal," she whispered in German, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "It's Sergeant O'Malley. I need to know the truth. Is there sickness in the barracks?" Klaus's face was a pale blur in the moonlight. He looked scared, but he also looked relieved. "Sergeant," he breathed. "Yes, many men are sick. Fevers, coughing. Some can barely breathe. The Oberleutnant has forbidden us from going to the infirmary." Kate's blood ran cold. "Why? He says it is a matter of honor." "He says we must not show weakness," Klaus replied, his voice laced with a bitterness that went beyond his years. "But men are getting worse. I think one man in my barracks might die soon." The pieces clicked into place. Someone was stealing the camp's medicine, and Richter's foolish pride was creating a black market demand and a cover for the thief. The men were suffering in silence, caught between a corrupt American soldier and an arrogant German officer. Kate knew what she had to do. There was no one to report this to. No one who would believe her. She had to handle it herself. The next day, she requested a 24-hour pass to visit a sick aunt in a nearby town. A story she knew Miller would grant without a second thought, eager to be rid of her for a day. Instead of visiting a fictional aunt, she went to the bank and withdrew nearly all of her savings, the money she had been setting aside since she enlisted. She went to a pharmacy in a town 50 miles away, a place where no one knew her. She told the pharmacist her brother was a doctor on the front lines in Europe, and she was helping him procure extra medical supplies to send over. It was a lie, but a plausible one in wartime. She bought as much sulfadiazine, a common drug used to treat pneumonia, as she could afford. Penicillin was for military use only, impossible to buy, but sulfa drugs would work. She returned late that night, the precious medicine hidden in a duffel bag. She went straight to Sergeant Rizzo's barracks. He was the only one she could trust. She explained everything: the missing penicillin, the sick prisoners, Richter's orders. Rizzo listened, his weathered face grim. He looked at the medicine, then at Kate's determined expression. He had seen real courage on the battlefield, and he was seeing it again now, in this small office, from a woman everyone else had written off. "You're crazy! You know that?" he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You'll be court-martialed for this. They'll say you're an enemy sympathizer." "I know," Kate said. "But we can't let those men die because of a thief and a fool." "Will you help me?" Rizzo let out a long sigh, then nodded. "All right, Kate, I'm in. What's the plan?" Their plan was simple and dangerous. Rizzo would use his position as sergeant of the guard to create a minor distraction on the far side of the camp, drawing the attention of the roving patrol. In that window, Kate would slip back to the fence, pass the medicine to Klaus, and give him instructions on dosages. It worked perfectly. The distraction pulled the guards away. Kate ran through the darkness, her heart in her throat. She reached the fence and found Klaus waiting, his anxiety palpable. "Here," she whispered, pushing the paper-wrapped bottles and pills through the wire. "This is sulfa. It should help with the pneumonia. 1 pill 4 times a day. Give it to the worst ones first. Crush it in water for those who can't swallow." Klaus's hands trembled as he took the medicine. "Sergeant, why are you doing this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. As he began to pull back into the shadows of the barracks, a beam of light suddenly pinned them both. Kate squinted, her blood turning to ice. A figure was walking toward them, slow and deliberate. It was Captain Miller. "Sergeant O'Malley," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold, sharp edge of a razor. "What in the world are you doing here?" The silence that followed Captain Miller's question was absolute. The beam of his flashlight held Kate and Klaus frozen like insects in amber. Klaus, terrified, scurried back into the darkness of the barracks, clutching the medicine to his chest. Kate stood her ground, her face pale in the harsh light, but her spine rigid. "Well, Sergeant?" Miller's voice was dangerously soft. "I find you out of your quarters after midnight at the prisoner enclosure, passing contraband to the enemy. I can't imagine what your excuse could possibly be." "It's medicine, sir," Kate said, her own voice level despite the frantic beating of her heart. "The prisoners are sick. The camp's medical supplies are being stolen." Miller let out a short, ugly laugh. "Stolen? Or is this just another one of your pathetic attempts to make yourself important? I think you're a sympathizer, O'Malley. Maybe even a spy. Sergeant of the Guard!" He bellowed into the night. 2 guards came running, rifles at the ready. Sergeant Rizzo appeared moments later, his face a mask of feigned surprise. "Place Sergeant O'Malley under arrest," Miller commanded, his voice ringing with triumph. "Take her to the stockade, on suspicion of treason." "Sir, there must be a misunderstanding," Rizzo began, stepping forward. "Are you questioning my orders, Sergeant?" Miller snarled. "Or are you a part of this? One more word out of you and you'll be joining her." Rizzo fell silent, but he shot Kate a look of helpless fury. The guards, with visible reluctance, took Kate by the arms. Being arrested was a surreal experience. The sounds of the camp seemed magnified, the chirping of crickets, the distant hum of a generator, the crunch of gravel under their boots. This was it. Her career was over. She would be lucky to avoid prison. The commotion had woken up half the camp. Lights flickered on in the administration buildings. As the guards escorted Kate across the main yard, a figure emerged from the infirmary. It was the camp doctor, Major Abrams, a weary man in his 50s. "What's all this racket, Captain?" Abrams asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Official business, Major," Miller said dismissively. "I've caught Sergeant O'Malley giving contraband to the prisoners." Dr. Abrams's tired expression sharpened with interest. "Contraband? What kind?" "I don't know. But she admits it was medicine," Miller said, putting the word in audible quotation marks. At that moment, the door to the camp's main office opened, and the camp commandant himself stepped out onto the porch. Colonel Davenport was a fair, no-nonsense officer, a man who rarely involved himself in the day-to-day running of the camp, but saw everything. Miller immediately snapped to attention. "Report, Captain," Davenport said, his voice calm but authoritative. Miller explained the situation with relish, painting Kate as a traitor who was undermining camp security. As he spoke, Dr. Abrams stepped forward. "Sir, if I may," the doctor interrupted. "I've had my own concerns for several weeks about our medical supplies, specifically our stocks of penicillin and sulfa drugs. They've been disappearing from my inventory almost as soon as they arrive. I've been unable to account for the losses." Davenport's gaze shifted from Miller to the doctor, his brow furrowed. "Are you saying you suspect theft, Major?" "Yes, sir." "I do." Suddenly another voice cut through the night, this one speaking accented German. "She was helping us! She brought us medicine!" Everyone turned. A group of German prisoners was standing at the fence line. Corporal Klaus was at the front, his face streaked with tears but his expression resolute. Behind him stood a dozen other men. Oberleutnant Richter was there too, trying to shove his way to the front. "Get back inside." "That is an order." Richter shouted at them in German. "No!" Klaus shouted back, his voice cracking but firm. He looked directly at the American officers. "Our men are sick, very sick. She brought us medicine because our officer told us to hide it, to show no weakness. She saved our lives!" Richter was appalled. This was a complete breakdown of discipline, a mutiny, but Klaus's defiance had broken the dam. Other prisoners started shouting in a mixture of German and broken English, all confirming the story. "Pneumonia!" one yelled. "Medicine!" She is good. Colonel Davenport held up a hand for silence. He looked at the agitated prisoners, at the humiliated Oberleutnant Richter, at the smug Captain Miller, and finally at Sergeant Kate O'Malley, who stood silently between her guards. He was a man who knew how to read a situation, and this one smelled rotten. Captain Miller released the sergeant. Davenport ordered. Major Abrams, I want you to conduct a full medical inspection of all prisoners, starting immediately. Lieutenant, he said to another officer, get me a new translator. I want to take statements from these men. And Captain, he said, turning back to a stunned Miller, you and I are going to go over the supply logs for the last 3 months, right now. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Dr. Abrams's inspection revealed a serious pneumonia outbreak in 2 of the barracks, just as Klaus had said. The new translator's interviews with the prisoners all told the same story. They were sick. Richter had ordered them to hide it, and the American sergeant had risked everything to get them medicine. In the records office, under the cold, watchful eye of Colonel Davenport, the truth of the missing supplies quickly became undeniable. The logs showed a pattern. The supplies were signed for by the camp's supply sergeant, a man named Henderson, who was known to be a close friend of Captain Miller. Davenport sent the military police to Henderson's quarters. They found a stash of stolen penicillin and sulfa drugs, along with letters detailing his plan to sell the medicine on the black market in Chicago. By dawn, the entire ugly picture was clear. Sergeant Henderson was the thief. And Captain Miller, in his obsessive, prejudiced quest to ruin Kate O'Malley, had been completely blind to the real crime happening right under his nose. His constant scrutiny of Kate had been the perfect distraction for Henderson. Miller hadn't just been incompetent. His personal vendetta had actively enabled the theft and endangered the lives of the prisoners under his care. The supply sergeant was placed in handcuffs. Colonel Davenport dismissed the other officers, leaving him alone with Captain Miller, whose face had turned a pasty shade of gray. Davenport walked to his window, looking out at the camp as the sun rose. I read your file on Sergeant O'Malley, Captain. Your formal review. It's filled with accusations of incompetence, insubordination, and lax discipline. He turned back to face Miller. It seems to me the only incompetence here is yours. Your pathetic grudge against that sergeant has not only violated the Geneva Convention by allowing these prisoners to fall ill due to negligence, but it has also made you an accomplice to a felony. You created an environment where a man under your command felt comfortable stealing life-saving medicine. Miller began to stammer an excuse, but Davenport cut him off. Pack your things. Captain, the colonel said, his voice flat and final. Report to my office at 800. You are being relieved of your command, effective immediately. Your career in this man's army is over. The morning bugle call at Camp New Hoffnung seemed to sound a different note, one of quiet resolution. The news of Captain Miller's dismissal and Sergeant Henderson's arrest spread through the camp like wildfire. By the time the staff and prisoners assembled for the morning muster, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that was part relief, part disbelief. Colonel Davenport stood before them all. He first addressed the staff, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. He announced Miller's removal from command and Henderson's arrest for theft, making it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated. Then he did something that stunned nearly everyone there. He called Sergeant Kate O'Malley to the front. Sergeant O'Malley acted with courage and integrity, the colonel announced, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the male soldiers who had mocked and underestimated her. She upheld the highest standards of the United States Army by choosing to protect human life, even at great personal risk. She identified a criminal conspiracy that her commanding officer was blind to. Her disciplinary review is canceled, and a formal commendation for her actions will be placed in her permanent record. She is hereby reinstated to her full duties as camp translator and liaison. Kate stood tall, her gaze fixed forward, as a wave of silence washed over the assembly. The men who had laughed at her now stood in humbled quiet. Sergeant Rizzo caught her eye and gave her a proud, subtle nod. She had not only been vindicated, she had been honored. Her victory was complete and undeniable. The impact on the German prisoners was even more profound. They had just witnessed something unthinkable, something that would have been impossible in their world. They had seen a powerful officer publicly disgraced and removed from command, not for losing a battle, but for an act of injustice. And they had seen a lone woman, who held a relatively low rank, elevated and praised for her moral courage. The American system of justice, which they had been taught was a sham, had just proven itself to be very real right before their eyes. In the barracks, Oberleutnant Richter found himself completely isolated. His authority, which he had tried to rebuild through fear and pride, was shattered. His men now saw him for what he was, a foolish, arrogant officer whose blind adherence to a cruel ideology had almost killed them. They no longer listened to his pronouncements or obeyed his petty orders. They turned their backs on him, leaving him to pace his corner of the barracks alone, a true prisoner trapped not by wire fences, but by the wreckage of his own beliefs. He was a relic of a world that was dying. In the weeks that followed, the camp was transformed. A new, more reasonable captain was put in charge. The sick prisoners recovered, thanks to the returned medicine and the diligent care of Dr. Abrams. The work details on the local farms resumed, but this time there was a new foundation of respect. The farmers had heard the story of what Kate had done, and their suspicion of the prisoners was replaced by a grudging admiration for the ones who spoke up, and a deep respect for the female sergeant who had overseen them. The war in Europe ended that spring. The news was met with a complex mix of joy, relief, and sorrow within the camp. The prisoners knew they would soon be going home, but home was now a broken, defeated country. They had spent months in the heart of America, and the experience had irrevocably changed them. On the day of their departure, the prisoners lined up at the same train station where they had arrived. They were no longer the defiant, confused men who had stepped off the train months ago. They were thinner, but their eyes were clearer. They were dressed in new, simple clothing provided by the Army. As they were about to board, Corporal Klaus approached Sergeant O'Malley, who was there to see them off. He stood before her, holding his cap in his hands. "Sergeant," he said in German, his voice thick with emotion, "we saw many unbelievable things in your country. The giant farms, the cars, the stores full of goods. For a long time, I thought those were the most unbelievable sights." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I was wrong. The most unbelievable sight I saw in America was you." Kate looked at him, surprised. "It was seeing you stand up to your captain," Klaus continued. "It was seeing you risk everything to bring us medicine when you had every reason to hate us. It was watching your colonel punish the man who was wrong and honor the woman who was right. In Germany, a man like Captain Miller would have been protected, and you would have disappeared. Here, justice is possible, even for your enemies." He looked out at the vast Minnesota landscape, at the endless sky. "That is the America I will remember. That is the kind of Germany I would like to help build." He gave a slight bow, put on his cap, and turned to board the train. Kate watched as the long train began to pull away, carrying the men back to their uncertain future. She stood on the platform, the commendation from the colonel tucked away in her file, the respect of her peers finally earned. She had never fired a shot in combat, never stormed a beach or taken a hill. But here, in this quiet corner of America, she had fought her own war. It was a war against prejudice, against injustice, and against the easy comfort of looking the other way. And she had won. She turned her face to the sun, feeling its warmth. The train disappeared over the horizon, its whistle a faint, lonely cry in the distance. Sergeant Catherine O'Malley remained, a solitary figure standing tall under the wide-open American sky, a testament to the fact that the greatest strengths are not always measured in firepower, but in the quiet, unyielding courage of the human heart.